Estella, it is, gosh, reading your fiction. And by the way, we were in Daniel Olivas's Lotus Land volume together way back in 2008.
Oh, you were? Which story was yours?
Mine was the long
I
story
remember.
cut short. And yep. And it's a big
Oh,
honor to be here now with you.
oh,
It's
I
almost
see it. I
like
see it. Oh, so many good people in this book. I mean, Rigoberto was in here, Elena Maria. Yeah, this was I was going to say, fucking great collection.
it is. It's incredible. And that was the seed for my my book, The Long Stories Cut Short.
Ah,
So anyway, lots of beginnings and middles and middles as we kind of move along in our careers and in our lives. And I'm just so honored and happy to be
right.
here with you.
Oh,
Estella,
me
let me
too.
jump.
Likewise. Igual, igual.
Gracias. So let me jump right in. So this is for my featured, it's like not exactly a column, but it comes out in every issue of the American Book Review, and it's called Interventions. And so maybe we can launch with that question, which you can answer in any way you feel comfortable, whatever comes to mind. But how might your work, your fiction, your work in general intervene politically, culturally, in any way that you see it intervening?
That's a good question. I think, yeah, writing is a political act, as somebody once said. And just writing about things that maybe disrupt the usual like stereotypes of what East LA is, of what and who Chicanas are or can be, I think is a political act because it does unsettle some people. I have found, when I was in my MFA program, I remember there was one instructor who was like, "Why are you writing about, you know, uh, people wanting to be white or having light skin? That's not a thing." It's like, and you should make this more universal because I didn't have any white characters in there, and luckily there were some Asian American women who were in there. It's like, oh, that's a thing, even in our culture, light skin and colorism. That is something that unfortunately does occur in our cultures. So I thought, yeah, you know what? People aren't reading about it. And I remember there was another more MFA stories, but I remember there was one particular student who said, I don't even know if this is East LA. I don't see any graffiti or any gangs. And I'm like, that's not all East LA is. There's so much more to our community than what you see in the movies or what's depicted in newspapers. So, I felt, in a way I was frustrated, but in a way it's like, yeah, you're seeing a new facet maybe that you've never seen or have bothered to look for about East LA or about Chicanos and Chicanas. I don't know.
Yeah,
Oh, you're muted.
I'm just thinking too. I absolutely, okay, you're maybe the first writer that maybe after Junot Diaz, where I really felt like the voice of the characters, the narrators, resonated with me in that they really are formed in really interesting ways by all sorts of aspects of culture, not just our very sort of tight kind of family proximate cultures, but also like Duran Duran and New Order and right Los Tigres and I
Mhm.
just loved that you freed me when I'm in your story worlds. And in that way, for at least for a reader like myself, there was as a Latinx reader, a great sort of intervention, right?
Mhm. Yes, yes, and I think that's good to know that you're free to think about yourself or others in your community. It's like, yeah, we can do this. I mean, I love reading about pop music in literature. I mean, I think that I always like that's the first thing I go into, the music, the sound. You want sound in your stories, and that's the sound of my childhood, my youth. Um, my community, and I think a lot of communities, whether Chicano or if you're oh God, what is Filipino, as one of my friends called it, or Chinese. It's like there's music, there's sounds, there's the voices of your parents, your tias, whoever. But music, I think it really, I like to use it as a marker, right? That's how you know what era you're in. Although sometimes I do mix up the music, but I think that also grounds me. It's like it's taking place at this time. TV shows are another thing too. TV culture is another one of my obsessions. So I think I put some TV programs in there too. So I very much love pop culture.
Yeah, I love it too. Me too. That's
I think we have
my
that in
entire.
common too.
I know.
Yeah, I mean we have that.
Definitely. So while we're on this subject, and the typical kind of question would be like, who are your influences, in a really serious way? But I'm thinking of influences in any and every way. What are things that really, like, you can be like, this really shaped me as a creative person or as a Chicana, you know?
Yeah, I think, well, obviously living in East LA, my family, lots of literary training. I think in my family, you really had to be outspoken. And I really wasn't when I was younger. And I think I really sort of kept to myself. I loved to read. I was a voracious reader when I was younger. I mean, I was the kind of kid who would read like the cereal box at the table, right? So this is before we had phones and all that. I would take my book. I know it's rude, but I would take my book, whatever book I was reading at that time, and just take it to the table and just read. Well, everybody was like yelling at each other, but sometimes, you know what? I was telling my husband this. It's like we really didn't have like the family dinner at the end of the day because everybody was either working, like my dad was working the graveyard shift. My mom was tired. You know what? She liked to just watch TV when she came home and eat her dinner. Our aunt was living with us, and she would actually prepare dinner. And me and my sister would eat at the table with her, or sometimes we eat by ourselves. And that's why I think I started to read too. That's what we had. I mean, or that's what I had. I love going into new worlds, right, with books. But I think that was an influence on me. I think the working class life of an immigrant family influenced me a lot. But that's where I discovered other beautiful writers, like what did I discover there? Or not discover, but they were there waiting for me. It was like Jane Austen. I love Jane Austen. I loved at the time the young adult writer Rosemary Sutcliffe, who wrote about Tristan and Isolde. That's where I first discovered like the Arthurian legends. Um, there's so many, just so many writers. And then I also discovered the Aztec calendar there. They used to have at the East L.A. library, they had this huge stone as a replica of the Aztec calendar. And I would stare at it and I'm like, what is this? And unfortunately, I grew up at a time where I think like the backlash against the Chicano movement had taken its toll. I think against a lot of movements, because I was growing up during the Reagan era. And if you remember that era, it was just like, nope. all the movements that had been so vibrant during the 70s, like the women's movement, the Black Panthers, the, Chicano movement, they had been effectively like stamped out. And when I was at Garfield High School, that's where they had the walkouts, and you'd see none of that. I had no idea that had happened at our high school. And that had only been like 10, 15 years earlier. My cousins took part in that, and I never knew. So, that was an influence too, the 80s. I mean, that whole era was just, it was the era of excess for certain people, but it was also the era of, I don't know, for me, it was repression and suppression culturally for people of color. Mm-hmm. So, so many. And music, of course, there was the music that was also a big influence. And I found it very freeing. I used to listen to the radio all the time. If I wasn't reading at the table, I was listening to my imitation Walkman because I couldn't afford the real thing. Or in the bathroom when I would shower, I'd listen to my favorite radio stations like KROQ or Kiss FM. Just music all the time. I wasn't brave enough to go out to the punk clubs because punk in L.A. was also on the rise too. I didn't get to see X or Alice Bag and the Bags. I'm sorry I missed it. But you know what? My parents would not have let me do that either. I think if I had been a boy, I probably could have. But since I was, la niña, la muchacha, I couldn't, so. But yeah, that whole era was a huge influence.
Estella, let me ask you. So you won a pushcart special mention, and you published in Nasty Women Poets. But of course, I know you from your active faith story in Latinos in Lotus Land, and then of course Chola Salvation. But let me ask you. Like these different forms, do they do something different for you? Are you called more to one than the other for the expression of one voice or story world more than the other? Yeah.
I like both forms. And I was so disappointed when I was applying to MFA programs that when I was applying, maybe it's different now, but you could only focus on one genre. Because I love poetry and I love fiction. So I had a sort of, it's like choosing, which baby do you love more? And I'm like, I love them both, which one do I choose? But I think my first love was fiction. It was fiction. I took a lot of short story writing courses here at the local community college. And I actually took one when I was an undergrad, and it was a short story. But I took a poetry class too, because I do love reading poetry. I love Sandra Cisneros' poetry. I love her fiction, but I think her poetry is so sublime at times. I think it's very underrated. But when I was an English major, and I loved poetry then too. Even the long, like epic poetry, like Paradise Lost or the Fairy Queen, although the Fairy Queen is irritating. Anyway, I loved the Odyssey, the Iliad, because those were written as poems, big epic poems, of course, but I love mythology too. But, if I can do both, I try, because sometimes when I'm writing, because I'm in various writing groups, the prompt, whatever speaks to me, sometimes I'll do a poem. I don't know why, or just a little piece of flash or a prose poem. I don't know. I think writing, if you're a writer, and you probably know this too, it's just like, you write whatever. I mean, sometimes I feel like, I really want to write a play, a script for a play. And I did that actually in graduate school. But I think if you love writing, you'll love any kind of writing. And whatever influences you, whatever prompts you to write the way you want to, you'll do it. Hopefully you have that sense of freedom. Sometimes I would be like, no, I can't write this. I'm not a poet. But I got over that. Sometimes you just want to write, what you want to write.
Do you have the long form in you as well? Or is there something happening there with, a novel, say?
Oh yeah, I'm working on a novel actually right now, and it's based on a short story in the Chola Salvation collection. Hopefully, I will finish it by the fall. That's what I'm hoping for. And I've been working on, and actually, that was my MFA thesis. It was the novel, but I think I just couldn't figure out how to shape it as well or do it justice in terms of like, what is the arc, of this story? How will it work? What is the structure? Because I'm like, do I want to do it from the point of view of just one character? Sometimes I'm like, no, it probably should be two characters. Which two characters? And I think I was still trying to decide that. So I've been letting it sit for a while. And that's why I focused on the short story collection, because I already had so many stories. I'm like, and the running theme is they're either taking place in East L.A. or all the characters are from East L.A. And most of the stories are rooted in the 80s. Some of them take place a little later. Some of them take place a little earlier. But I think, no, I will get that novel. And I'm hoping I can get another novel too, because I already have another idea for another novel. So, yeah.
It's interesting that you bring this up and relate it also to the Chola Salvation, because when I was reading, especially Happiness is Right Next to You and I Hate My Name, I felt like there was almost a kind of braided narrative, where I started thinking about the collection as a braided narrative.
Yes, I think you're right. You picked up on that because those two stories I told by the point of view of the same character, Lucha. So yeah, and one of them is a chapter where she's younger, right? She's still in junior high school, and the other one she's grown up and she's going to college, and she's still trying to figure out, as we all were. I know I was, trying to figure out in our youth, what does love mean? What does it mean to fall in love when you're super young? And why do we hang on to loves that are probably not very good for us or that really weren't real love at all? So yeah.
Anyway, I love them. I love all of them.
Oh, thank you.
Another, I was wondering in that interview that you did with Daniel for La Bloga, I believe it's where you mentioned he asked you about the kind of style, and you mentioned East Los Real or East Los Rio. And that was really interesting to me for a number of reasons. One, my sense of your style is that it just hit me when I was reading your work, muscular. And I don't know if that resonates at all, but my question here is, and I see it with my work, I see it all the time with Latinx's, Chicano authors, Publishers Weekly and Kirkus, they come along and they always want to put like magical or mystical. And on our writing, right?
Yes.
So, but this is a very complicated way of getting at the question of, I guess, style.
Yeah. I don't know. I think my style, I love to use a lot of the language, right? I like to use the Spanish, the caló. I guess what I mean by East Los Real is just, there's a no nonsense blunt, style that a lot of, I don't know if you grew up working class or not, but white, black, Chicano, all of us who have grown up working class were like, oh yeah, my mom was never this. She was like, if you didn't like the dinner, you didn't eat it, then you make your own or you don't eat, because this is not a restaurant, and mom's tired. But I think it's the bluntness, and language is a part of that. I mean, there's no there's no such thing as being like super polite. If mom was not pleased with your behavior, she told you straight up. It's like, hey, ¿qué chingadera es esto? Move your mugrero. She didn't speak like Carol Brady on the Bunch, but I think, Juno Diaz does that too. I mean, Drown, I remember reading Drown. It's like, yeah, that's how my mom talks. That's how my whole family talks. The San Luis Cisneros doesn't do a whole lot of that. I think hers is gentler. She has a more gentle way with her narration. I think mine is more like, this is the voice that I hear from my past, or even that I still hear when I gather with my relatives when we go back to L.A. for anything. We're just like, boom, boom, we're just straightforward. And my husband's like, wow, your guys are a tough crowd. It's like, yeah, you got to develop tough skin when you grow up, the way we do, because it's a matter of survival. If you're going to spend your whole time being hurt by everything, it's going to be a rough life. I mean, that's my philosophy, and it's probably, a little outdated, but, it's when you grow up, working for everything, you don't take anything for granted, and you're not one to brook any like nonsense or fools. You just like, hey, just tell me straight up, is this going to happen or not? Or just, you got to do your work. You better clean up your room, or I'm going to, te voy a dar un chanclazo or something. So I think that's what influences my style. So we go back to the whole influence thing, and then the language too. I mean, I think that's music to me too. Hearing Spanish, hearing it mix, the Spanglish, I think it's beautiful. And I think that's so wonderful now that there's more, I see it proliferating literature. But you know what? It always was in literature. Because I remember reading, what was it? The Wasteland, right? By T.S. Eliot. He had all these languages. He had French, German, Sanskrit. I think, I love seeing that. I love seeing different languages, but it was always a white writer who was allowed to use it. And I know, I'm sure you know this too, but when I was using it, people had an issue with it. And I'm like, you don't have an issue with T.S. Eliot, or even, what's his name, Tolkien? Did he use Elvish? Somebody used Elvish in their writings. Like, you don't have a problem with that, but you have a problem with my Spanish? Okay. I think Juno Diaz pointed that out too. I'm like, yeah, that's interesting. Well, I'm going to use it. I want to use Spanish. I want to use all this, even the swear words,
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I
beautiful.
think that's part of it.
Yeah, no, you're right. And actually the way I'm glad we talked about it in this sort of question of style, because a lot of people think that we just use it as like a cultural marker. And in fact, you use it, I use it, others use it in ways that are part of the aesthetic. Yeah.
And yeah, I think I think it does add to the beauty of it all. I remember reading Richard Wright's Black Boy, and he was using, a lot of African American terms. And I'm like, I'm not familiar with this. What does it mean? Or even just the syntax of the language, was different. And I'm like, wow. I mean, I was just like, I nerded out on the styles of how authors, like, how do they place their languages, or how do they place their words in sentences, and I think that's important, because I think that's what, I don't know, that's what feeds, like you said, your aesthetic vision. It's like, this is the way it should sound like. This is what moves me. This is what brings out whatever feeling I'm trying to bring out. So I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. No, absolutely. And yeah, I was raised by a working class mom, single mom. And yeah, there was no BSing when you like, it was this or nothing, it's like you starve or you eat, this is what we're going to have for, whatever. And chores, I mean, you didn't even dare not do chores because,
no.
Yeah, no. But, I was thinking as you were talking and you mentioned all these other kind of, writers, and by the way, including Sandra Cisneros' work, which I find to be very kind of precious in the use of language in ways that, I'll be honest, don't resonate with me.
Right.
They don't get me, but that's neither here nor there. What I'm really excited about in your work is like self-discovery, but self-discovery not in the kind of cliched, like, okay, this is the part in the story like we have with James Joyce where you have the epiphany and then, you know, there's this, you know, character change, etc. But self-discovery that's, you know, blunt, as you put it, and but also filled with humor, and that kind of comes at culture, you know, cultural traditions and heritage, like the quinceañera, you know, all these things that sometimes I feel like maybe we've been too gentle with as a community of writers, as Chicano, Chicana, Latinx writers. And I love it because you hit it and you go for it. And everything that comes with the self-discovery is raw and real and East Los real, maybe. But tell me about your sense of self-discovery in your stories.
Yeah, I don't have the traditional epiphany. Sometimes my characters, they don't make, you know, the realization. I was just thinking when you were speaking about my character Felipe, who is just like this, you know, he's just frustrated and pissed. And you know what? In the end, you know, he doesn't care. He doesn't care. You know, he just realizes, you know, I need to take a stand for my pride. And I think somebody pointed that out, that a lot of my characters, they have like this self-destructive pride, you know, that they rather maintain than, you know, make a healthy realization about how destructive that pride can be. It's like, you know what, sometimes that's all we got. You know, that's all we have, as, you know, we don't have money. Maybe we don't get the girl or the guy, but I could do this. I have some form of, maybe it's just having just a little bit of power, you know, just, I can control this. Everything else is uncontrollable around me, but I can control this. And yeah, maybe it's terrible, but I'm going to do it anyway. You know, sometimes, well, like Isabella in Chola Salvation. I mean, she runs away. I mean, that's the only thing she can do. And that's her power to, and she can resist her father finally in the end, and her parents. She's like, you know, no, you're destroying me. I'm saying no to this destruction. And maybe you're going to completely cut me off. I'm fine with that. Because, you know, I think she has a little bit of that epiphany herself. But some characters, like I said, Felipe, just, or even Lucha, when she tells Jorge or George, you know, when she mouths to him, I still love you, you know, she's still going to hang on to that love. She's not, and she's okay with it. There's an acceptance, I think, maybe. That's a kind of power to it. It's like, I'm going to accept this for right now. I still love you. You don't love me. It wasn't a real love, but you know what? I still want to hold on to it. I don't know why, but I do. And that's how people are. That's just how it is. That's real to me. Sometimes we don't make healthy realizations. Maybe you do. Maybe later on you do. But sometimes we just don't. For better or for worse, sometimes we just don't. Yeah. I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I also love that your mamas are, they're not your typical, I mean, you know, very often whenever we have a gay Latino character, there's this like, you know, rejection and all sorts of, that's where like usually the tension is built. And, you know, those stories, I love those stories where it's just like, so is this the dude for you kind of thing? Okay, cool. And it's like, hey, you know what? Yeah, we don't have that. We don't have those stories out there right now. And I love that, by the way. I just wanted to kind of throw that out there. Maybe a question, maybe not.
Oh, thanks.
What I did love too is the hair and the hair cutting and the connection to community, but also like trauma,
Yeah.
and makeup as well. But tell me, maybe, I don't know if you want to get into any of those, but I'd love to hear like what you think about this stuff in your story worlds.
Oh, yeah. No, I think, yeah, hair, it's still my obsession. Makeup, not so much, but I think appearances. I mean, I think when I remember growing up, I don't know how it was for you, but as young women, girls, I remember my aunt and my mom, even my dad, this whole, they were always so tyrannical about the way we look, about policing, our looks, our bodies. I was lucky I was thinner when I was younger, only, because my dad was always on my sister about being overweight, or others. He would make a comment out. It's like, oh, she's so fat, or great dad. Or he would get on me about like wearing, like, why don't you look nice? I am like, Mireya in some ways in that story, because I remember he'd say, why don't you fix yourself up? Why don't you pluck your eyebrows? Why don't you, paint your lips? And I'm like, what? My brother never got any of that. None of the boys that I knew ever got any of that. I mean, and maybe they got something different. I'm sure their appearance was commented upon, but for us and then high heels. Why don't you wear heels? Why don't you wear this? But you don't want to look too slutty, right? You don't want to look like a, piruja out there. But I think, the moment that you start developing, especially as a teenager, that's when it really comes down hard on you. Why don't you wear more dresses? Why don't you wear this? Why don't you? It's like, oh my God, leave me alone. Hence diving into books, because I'm like, I don't want to hear it. Leave me. It's like, when are you going to get a boyfriend? And it's like, but if I do, you're still going to be like, well, you can't really go out with him. You can't do this. You can't do that. I mean, it was just so much. You can't win. Anyway, and the whole hair thing, I remember hair was so traumatic for me because you wanted the right hairstyle. Back in the 70s, the whole, feathering of the hair, you had to get it just right. And there were some, I didn't have the best hairstylist in East L.A. Or I just never found one. But I remember just getting such a bad haircut. And I'm like, how am I going to go to school? And, of course, you can't tell that to your mom, because your mom's going to be like, I paid $20 for that haircut or whatever. Why are you crying? At least you have hair. I don't know if you've ever seen George Lopez. George Lopez is, and it's like, yeah. It was, my mom was kind of like that. She's like, why are you crying? Get over it. Just go to school. So, but I think those are also places where I remember just sitting there, and when my mom went to get her hair done, sitting there and relaxing and just, seeing the other women just chat with each other. You'd have the music going. Sometimes there'd be a little television there with the latest popular novela, running. But they were very, those were spaces that were very, especially for women. It was all women. It was just like very comfortable for me. Barber shops were different. I remember going to the barber shop with my dad, and just is a very, masculine, macho, energy there, right? There's no, I don't remember the music. I remember them playing games on the radio. You could hear the soccer game or the baseball game going on the radio. So again, with the sound, I really picked up on the sound, and the voices were so deep. And sometimes, they'd get into some kind of an argument, which I thought was kind of scary. Although now that I look back on it, it's like they were probably just, playing around with each other. They weren't really arguing. But it was kind of intimidating for me going into that male space. So yeah, that's, you know, what I wanted to do with my main character, my protagonist in Little Soldiers, just to recreate that atmosphere of all these men talking about sports and, you know, what it means to be a man. So
really powerful. Yeah, and of course for me brought up all sorts of memories, most of them traumatic. The barber shop, that is, because I would end up coming out with hair that was like, you know,
yeah.
but the in Pepper Spray, the story Pepper Spray, there's I don't know if I've seen it before in our fiction traditions, but I know it's there. Maybe Tomas Rivera even has some of it, but you have a kind of, there's a beginning of an exploration of Asian and Latinx kind of race
Yeah.
relations. And I just wondered about that a little bit. Maybe go wherever you want with that.
Yeah. No, and again, you know, because we did have in East LA, I mean, we have like those little markets like on corners inside the neighborhoods, and they're usually run by Korean owners or Korean American owners. And there was really never any interaction. You know, they just would, you know, you pay them, you didn't really talk to them. And I'm like thinking, it's like, why wasn't, and maybe some people did. I know I never did. I was too shy. I was too, I think, intimidated or something. But I just wondered, it's like, would it have been like? Because I know some of them were, you know what? I don't even know how I know this. You know, some of them I think were immigrants who had just come from Korea. Because I remember hearing one guy talking in Korean to his wife. And I'm like, wow, what language is that? At the time, I was really like into anime. I'm like, is that Japanese? I mean, obviously I was very ignorant about, you know, the languages, the Asian languages, but I remember hearing them talk, and it just blew my mind. It's like, wow, they're here in East LA. What are they doing here? You know? And then when the LA riots happened, ironically, I was actually in Japan, and I remember seeing the image of a Korean man who was a store owner with a shotgun, and he used he had a T-shirt on with I think it was a T-shirt, I can't remember, the Malcolm X saying, you know, what's that famous saying of his that we need to, oh God, what was it? I can't remember. I'm sorry. Can you help me, Frederick, on that one? Do you remember what it was?
We'll fill it in. We'll fill in the blank.
Yeah, we'll fill it in. I'll think about it. But it was a Malcolm X saying about, you know, being militant and defending ourselves. And here he was, a Korean man with a gun, and I think he was in South Central LA. And I'm like, that has so many layers of meaning. I don't even know what to make of that. But he was trying to protect his store from being burned, and I don't know if he had any clue as to why, you know, the uprising was happening in LA at that time, because that still reverberates. I mean, in our community too. I mean, especially now, right, with Black Lives Matter, and then I think with ICE now in the community of East LA.
Yeah.
Anyway, so it was. No, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, yeah, I mean, I think what you're talking about is, you know, Malcolm X's stance really when it came kind of to push against MLK Jr., who was all about, you know, taking like the peaceful approach. And Malcolm X was like, yeah, let's do that. But at the same time, you get pushed so far into a corner and you've got to resort to violence, right? But yeah, no, that's really powerful. I'm glad you brought that up. It's something even that's happening right now with Israel and in the Gaza, Gaza and the Palestinians, right? I mean, you know, people are like, oh my God, you know, the Israelis, and you're like, well, you keep pushing a population of people and you continue to commit acts of genocide and take lands away. And yeah, people
Yes.
are going to push back.
Yes. And it's not anti-Semitism. That's about, they have a human right to, live in their homes without being, harassed. I think a lot of people would agree with that. It's by any means necessary. That was the phrase, by any means necessary, by Malcolm X, right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah. And
still continues.
Yeah, I know. I'm going to push us into kind of publishing a little bit of the history there. You mentioned, I believe it's also in that interview with Daniel, how Dignidad Literaria really inspired you to kind of, get your work over there to Arte Público. But let me ask you this, and I love Arte Público, but what did you think about, the big East Coast publishers, and what were you thinking, and why, the decision finally for Arte Público? And I'm not saying that Arte Público is like a second choice by any means. I think it's a first choice, but definitely everybody has their story, I think.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good question too. I think Arte Público, ever since I found out that they had first published, again, Sandro Cisneros, Elena Maria Viramontes, I'm like, it just became the goal for me. It became like that's the gold standard for me. And even when I was on the East Coast, and I remember some guy, oh God, I can't remember, from a major, it wasn't a publishing house. I think it was a literary journal. We actually gave him our stories to look over, our fiction cohort. He came when he came to my story right away. He's like, I don't understand. Who's this Virgin de Guadalupe? Nobody's going to know who that is. You're talking about, and then what's all with this Spanish? Nobody's going to understand. If you're trying to write for a mainstream audience, this isn't going to work, or something like that. But I just remember the Virgen de Guadalupe comment. I'm like, you don't know who the Virgen de Guadalupe is? Don't even talk to me. So I could sense, right, there's this disdain even then. And I'm like, you know what? These stories are like my babies. I'm not going to subject my babies to this, to people who refuse to make the effort to try and understand. I studied literature for I don't know how many years, Shakespeare, T.S. Eliot, I always researched or looked up things. I made the effort. And I'm like, you guys aren't going to make the effort? I don't need, no. I don't need this. So, and that goes back to what Dignidad Literaria, is talking about the racism, the implicit racism that's, permeated this industry for so many, decades. It's like, I get it. Maybe I should have, submitted to them to see, but you know what? Arte Público right away. You know what? I submitted it on a Friday and Nicolas got back to me on Sunday. I'm like, yay, and so that's,
Yeah.
And, that's all I'm trying to say is they get it. They get it. And I just didn't want to I'm not contorting myself for these people anymore. I know it's just, my ego took a big hit, but, it's not just about ego. I think it's also about, you know what? I really want to reach an audience that, I know there's an audience for this. So I want to reach them. Arte Público reaches my audience.
Yeah, no, really powerful. Thanks for sharing that. You talk about, I think again with Daniel, that your favorite story is Chola Salvation. But what I'm interested in, what was the most challenging one to write and why? And were there any surprises in that process in general?
I think, yeah, you know what? I think I immediately thought of Boulevard Saints. That one was tough to write, only because, I'm trying to explore, it's like, why was my high school so, you know, why didn't they teach us about what happened? I love school. I'm a nerd. I loved all my teachers, and maybe I still idealize them in some ways. But I'm thinking, why didn't they, teach us any history of what went on here? At one point, because I took AP US history, and I'm like, our teacher, and maybe this could be a story, you know, instead of taking us all the way to downtown, for a field trip, why didn't he just walk us down Whittier Boulevard? Why didn't he just walk us around our own school and say, this is where they had the blowouts and this is why they blew out? Why didn't he take us to the Silver Dollar Cafe where Ruben Salazar, the reporter for La Opinion, was murdered by LA County Sheriff? I mean, there's so many places within East LA that are historic, or even like the lowriders that used to, at that time, they had started blockading Whittier Boulevard because they wanted to stop the lowriders from cruising. And I think it was hard for me to know. It's like, yeah, you know what? All my teachers were white. They were just, you know, as liberal as they like to portray themselves at that time, they were still, complicit, with the white supremacy that underlines, education, public education, especially. And I know it's hard to be a teacher. It's super hard. And you have to follow all these rules. When I was older, I figured that out. It's like, yeah, it's teaching. And especially if you're a teacher of color and you want to teach about, other cultures at that time, I don't think they were allowed to do that. Or even if they weren't, I'm like, so what? You should have done it anyway. You should have. I think so. Cisneros' book came out in 84. I was in high school, like from 83 to 86. I'm like, why didn't they include that in the curriculum? I mean, but who knows? I mean, and so I think I try to explore that in that story. What is going on with that story? I think, and I also put in, a lot of us were very apathetic too at that time. I mean, it's not the students' fault that they're apathetic. There's a reason probably why they're apathetic. And I remember the contempt people had for like this whole Chicano movement and Chicano studies. The thing to do was, no, you want to make money. Chicano studies is not going to make money for you. You got to go into something more lucrative, like something in math and science, like being an engineer. That'll make money, or being I don't know, an accountant. But literature, even though deep down that's what I wanted to do. I mean, I wanted to focus on English and writing, but I think just the attitude. I think I was trying to explore, like, what happened, what changed, why did we not care anymore about our community and our rights and what we deserved? We just lost it. And, I think it had a lot to do with obviously, with the whole system, with the administrators, with LAUSD. Although, you know what? I'm glad I went through public school too. It's conflicting. A lot of conflicting emotions going on there. There's no one simple answer, to sound cliche, but that's true. I don't know. That's a tough question.
When you were, this is a nice kind of segue into the question I have about writing programs, creative writing programs. And of course, Juan Felipe Herrera and Juno Diaz and Sandra Cisneros have all famously talked about their very alienating experiences with the Iowa Writers Workshop. But I wonder what tell me about your sense of creative writing programs, including even the Cornell MFA program, and maybe pros and cons?
Oh, the pros. Oh, I mean, the pros are many. I think you have time to write. I think that's important. You have time to, and especially at Cornell, they only select like 4 people for fiction and 4 people or 4 students for poetry every year. So there's only 8, and it's small. And the reason that it's small is because they give you a fellowship. So you don't have to pay for tuition. You do have to teach, I think, in your second year, but your first year, I don't know if it still works that way, but you spend it editing Epic, the literary journal, which is a very well-known literary journal. So that was a complete honor. And the reason that I went to Cornell, not only because I didn't have to pay, but Elena was there, right? When I was like shopping around for, MFA programs, I really, really wanted a Chicana writer to work with. And I looked here in Arizona, and did I apply to? I think I had missed the deadline for ASU, but I applied to like 16 schools, and I was just like, I really want Cornell because of Elena, and yay, I got in. So that I think that somebody told me that too. It's like pick a program where you know who the writers are and who do you want to work with. So I knew Elena right away. I wanted to work with her. And I think those are the pros. I don't think Cornell, it didn't feel, because I've known people who come out of Iowa and they said the pressure is immense and the competition is immense because Iowa is the granddaddy of all the writing programs. So I don't think that pressure was there, which was nice. And there was a nice community outside of the writing cohort of Chicano students or Chicano. Yeah, there was Chicano, my Chicano colleagues who I'm still friends with. Actually, 2 of my Cornell colegas are over here at the U of A. They're teaching here. So that was nice. That was great. And of course, you're near New York, right? Which is the editing or the literary mecca, right, of the US. So, I mean, that wasn't my scene so much. And that really wasn't what drew me out there. But I mean, that's a nice perk. But you do have the time. And I remember just spending like hours in the morning. That was my time to write. And I would just go to a coffee house and I just write, and read. They have a beautiful library. The campus is amazing. And they would bring in these guest writers to come speak with us. I mean, I saw Salman Rushdie. I met Sherman Alexie. Sandra Cisneros actually came out too. Amazing writers, amazing resources. So I think there are pluses, but again, there are the downsides. Like, it's still a very white. I think most writing programs are still very white. They're still very white, and they still have people like that editor who's like, "Who's the Virgin of Guadalupe?" Hopefully they're better now. I don't know, but somehow maybe not.
Yeah.
Although, like here at
somehow.
the U of A, they have Manuel Munoz, and and they have a big writing community of Latino writers out here too. So that helps a lot. I think being in the Southwest, I love it here. I didn't plan to stay on the East Coast at all. I knew I'm coming back. I'm either coming back to L.A. or I'm coming back to Tucson because I don't know. It feels like familia out here.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Do you feel, are there any new gen Latinx, Chicanx authors that you kind of feel a real affinity for, or that you kind of are, like, wow, okay, cool. This is knocked my socks off. And you can go with it. I'm putting you on the spot here. So, just go with that as you will.
Oh my God, there's so many. I mean, I'm still reading so many writers. Who's oh God, let me see. I'm just looking at my
Yeah, take a look,
little
take your time.
library over here.
Yeah.
Let's see. Well, I mean, Miriam, of course.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Ta-da, with her
Yeah.
mane, right?
Yeah.
Miriam. I don't know if you read Caribbean, Fragosa, Eat the Mouth That Feeds
Mm-mm.
You.
Mm-mm. No.
She's been getting a lot of buzz. Actually, all right, so here's another little story. Miriam and Caribbean and I used to be in a writing group in Long Beach with Tatiana de la Tierra and
Oh,
Grisela
wow.
Suarez. I don't know if you're familiar. Yeah, so we were called Las Guayabas. And we used to meet like every Saturday or something. And we just used to get together to write, to share our writing. And I think that community of writers, I've noticed that a lot of Latinas, or maybe not a lot, but I know some Latinas, that's where they get their start, or that's
Mm.
where they get their encouragement. Because when you're feeling like crap, it's like, oh my God, I just got rejected again. This guy doesn't know who the Virgin of Guadalupe is. They support you. They like, no, you got to go on. You got to write. Your writing's good. So I think, yeah, no matter who writes, I celebrate them all. Like right now, I'm reading Ivelisse Rodriguez, Love War Stories. I have all these books. And I just finished reading Trust Me by Richard Santos. I just feel there's such an abundance. Like this one, Kristen Valdez Quaid, another beautiful writer. There's so much now than there was when I was like writing or coming up. I'm like, this is amazing. I feel like I'm in Latina, Chicana nerd paradise with all these beautiful writers. I mean, I still have some of Cisneros on my desk. And but I've also been loving Dorothy Allison, another
Mm.
working class writer. I think I've also been discovering working class writers. John Fante, who was from LA and who writes about LA. I don't know. I mean, I love them. I love so many of them. I think though the ones who really stick out because of her voice, like she's tough. Miriam,
Yeah. Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
she's like the one to be or the one to aspire to in many ways. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, if I have to pick one,
Mm-hmm.
it's gonna be La Medium.
I'm with you there. So, as we wrap this up, you've already talked about the novels actually that you're one gestating and one currently working on, if I got that right. But is there something else that you would like to share that's kind of percolating or doing something? And maybe even before that question, and maybe you already answered this with talking about the importance of communities of writers, but do you have any advice for future Gen Latinx authors? And then let's go to this question of like, what's next?
Find your community of writers, find your writing groups, join as many as you can, And I actually now, with this whole like COVID thing, now that we're opening up again, but when it was closed, I discovered that there were so many writers around or writing Latinx writing groups around the country. And the beauty, if there is some beauty to this whole COVID crap, is the fact that we could Zoom in together. I'm like, because I was taking part in a New Mexican poetry writing group led by Manuel Gonzalez, who was the poet laureate of Albuquerque. And it's still going on. I still participate. A fantastic supportive community. And we read our work and he gave us these beautiful prompts. And I used some of these prompts for my writing group that I have here in Tucson. And it's just so uplifting. And you're pretty like-minded because, when when I tell like my sister or my cousins about my writing, they're like, oh, that's nice. But when I find other Chicanas or Chicanos who write, they're like, oh yeah, we get it. We want to do this too. So writing, reading, read, of course. Every writer, that's always your homework. Read. I remember when I first got into Cornell, Elena said, be sure you read, all the whatever Chicana writer you could get your hands on. So I started reading, Cherry Moraga, Ana Castillo, I forget who else was, but all the major ones that were happening in the early aughts. I'm like, whatever I could get my hands on who was Latina. Oh, Michelle Cerros. Oh, loved her too. Whoever was Latinx or Chicana, I read them. I read them all. Even who else? Who was who's the publisher? Wisache, Dago Guild. He was another one too.
Talk about a muscular writer, right? That guy.
Yes.
For sure. Yeah, and he got himself into lots of trouble early on with some of his nonfiction statements, right? With Chicanas especially. I don't know if you remember, but anyway, that's neither here. Yeah, it's not,
I know. Well, that's the whole machismo thing that I have other stories about Latino writers that I'll tell you about later. but anyway.
Yeah. So tell me, so you've got your novels. Is there something else that, like is, I don't know, a TV show I'm imagining or something? I don't know.
Oh, I would love it if Netflix would like serialize Chola Salvation. They're looking for more like Latinx, Chicanx stories. Please, I invite you to to do that with Chola Salvation. I think Netflix does a fantastic job with some, not all. But I think, why not? Let's do it. I'm open to having them do it. And if they want me to write a script, I will gladly, do it too. But hey, come at me with that. I'd like to publish some poetry too. I would love to do a book of poetry because I have a whole bunch of poetry. So I'm going to see if I can get that off the ground too.
Beautiful. Thank you, Estella.